966.
We are pleased to welcome onto the 966 Dr. Sean Foley. Dr. Foley specializes in Middle East history and the cultural, political, and religious trends in the wider Islamic world. He is a professor at Middle Tennessee State University and received his PhD and master's from Georgetown and received his bachelor's with honors and distinction from UC Berkeley. Dr. Foley is author of the book Changing Saudi Arabia, Art, Culture, and Society in the Kingdom, which is widely regarded as the definitive text on the Saudi arts community, and has written and spoken extensively on arts in the Muslim world, smoking in the Muslim world, and contemporary culture in Saudi Arabia, including on music. One recent piece he published with AGISW entitled The Gulf's New Sound, Indie Music and Global Change is about the new talented class of musicians in the Gulf states. Dr. Foley, thank you so much for joining us on the 966.
Thank you very much for having me. Again, it's good to know I'm joined with esteemed August company, people who have known people who I've respected for a long period of time, but also I really respect what you're doing here. One of the wonderful things about Saudi society and things that I respect and have grown to love is the idea of dialogue. That you have a majlis in many places, in homes or in businesses, and the idea of sitting and talking for an extended period. Get some coffee, let's have some dates, let's have some tea, some good food, but sitting and talking. And the idea of that dialogue, one of the early art exhibits was "We need to talk." And, sometimes in the West, if we hear that phrase, "we need to talk," maybe something scary is about to happen. But no, "we need to talk" is also a way by which you can bridge commonality, bridge differences, forge new commonalities, forge new community, find way by which we can include a larger group of people, even if they might disagree on a lot of things. And as an American, but in a society which is driven by divisions and oppositional forces, that's our politics. You see in our culture all over the place. The idea of developing and thinking of new ways of bringing dialogue, of bringing people together of different perspectives and ideas, and finding ways by which we can talk and think differently is very powerful. And I appreciate and applaud the public service that you're doing, not only to build bridges among us who are interested in the kingdom as scholars and experts, but also the wider world, and particularly between the United States and Saudi Arabia, countries with deep ties, but also with differing perspectives on the world and differing histories, and for which it's a good time and a right place to begin to have these type of conversations.
Wow, they're very kind. Thank you, Sean. And Lucian, we need to find a way to capture that and use it in our marketing. And
I do my best.
It also prompts me we have to reconsider our name. We might want to change it to the 966 Majlis.
Yeah, or something like that.
Virtual Majlis, yeah.
Virtual Majlis. And again, that's what our artists were thinking about. And the whole point with an arts gallery was to create a place where people would have to come together and look at art. And then they realized that you could do that with social media. And that social media created opportunities for people to discuss. You do that with television, with movies, and it's a wonderful way. I mean, look, we live in a world where people think, act differently, have different perspectives. How do you deal with that? I mean, I'll give you an example. Watching a documentary, and it talked about one group visiting another community, and into a political conflict out in Oregon, and on Netflix. And one of the people said, "Well, it's like a basketball game. We play, and then we end." The problem is that's not the way politics works. Yeah, the election may happen, but that doesn't mean that's the end.
The game's not over.
The game's not over.
Right.
And one of the things I find refreshing about Saudi artists throughout any genre you can talk about, and we'll talk a bit about Vision 2030, for which they are very closely tapped, is they are thinking about how to deal with those problems. How do you deal with, one of those wonderful moments as an instructor, you rarely get them. I had Hisham Faqih speaking to my class. It was a wonderful assignment that Hisham was able to do, was sort of working with, and I had to speak to my class about a movie he had done called Baraka Meets Baraka. It was really nice of him to speak to my students about this. And we were discussing back and forth about Saudi arts. And it was an interesting question that one of my students, a very bright student, asked him. And it got him to say that he was interested, and what he basically translated is say, we're looking at oppositional forces. And we're looking at finding ways to get around them. I mean, the classic Western example is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Sort of thing we all learn in school. I know, Richard, you said your daughter is at Clemson, yes?
Right.
Yeah, so that's probably something she may learn in one of her classes. Oh, very good. Excellent as well.
Well, you know,
Tigers.
for as much as I'm paying, I got a cup.
Excellent, good. And again, I appreciate, Lucian, you mentioned Berkeley. And again, we're wearing Berkeley colors blue today. So that was great with that.
We all got the memo.
Yeah, we got the memo on that. But I should note that when he said in this sort of interaction in class, and he said it was a wonderful moment, he was talking about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's sort of our idea. You have two options. One army fights another army, and then you have a synthesis. What happens if it's just those two armies together in the same place? So you've got this sort of tension. How do you work about that? How do you think about that? How do you create a type of art or create a type of conversation where those types of differences can coexist without causing problems that we can get along?
And it's interesting. Your particular nexus as a professor and as a academic and historian, you know, you're interweaving a lot of things. But I want to get, for our viewers and our listeners, I want to get a starting point, and I want to get the prelude to what you're saying. You know, the oppositional forces, sort of how the art scene evolved and that sort of thing. And I know, and let me start with what most people know about Saudi Arabia, and insofar as its Vision 2030, and as we know, it's mostly top line topics, NEOM, women driving, sports acquisitions, which is a big
golf
in the big picture these days, and golf. Did you say golf or did Lucian say golf?
Yeah, I just said golf.
I didn't say it.
Oh, excellent. You're Lucian's best friend.
Yeah, no, golf. I mean, golf too. And yeah, and people ask me about it. You're right. And not only top line too. Remember,
wait, Sean, before you get going. I'm bound and determined to get you in a lane, at least at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so the point being is that as unknown to most, general observers, is that a big part of Vision 2030 is a vibrant society. And, and that runs the gamut from better health habits, more Saudis volunteering, more family entertainment options, heritage, but also the arts. And we're talking across the board, cinema, film, but, painting, sculpture, music, even music. And obviously you're an expert. I mean, Lucian, you're deeply involved in this. And Lucian talked about changing Saudi Arabia, your book, 2019, which we recommend. But let us find a starting point. And so how did you first get involved? How has it evolved? And I think we'll get to all this. And how is it faring under the Vision 2030 in the Vision 2030 world?
First of all, thank you for that introduction and keeping me in a lane. I'm an academic, so we like to talk. There's a great phrase from old movie set in San Francisco. I like a man who likes to talk. Great phrase. Maltese Falcon. Took me a minute to remember that.
Yes.
Yeah, great phrase. So let me stay in my lane. I'll do my best.
No, I didn't say stay in the lane. I just said we just want to start you in a lane.
Yeah, and in terms of we'll start in a lane, and then we'll get me in the right place. First, I come from an artistic family. I've been interested in the arts for a while. My grandfather was in vaudeville, knew George M. Cohan. His draft card from World War I lists him as a performer, actually, and his occupation actually on Broadway in Times Square. It's really pretty amazing. From World War I. My father's a poet and a writer. So I come from an artistic tradition, so I'm always sort of interested in that. But my training had been in traditional history, political science, and I got really lucky. A good friend of mine my wife and mine from Malaysia was getting married in the UK, and I had a fellowship to go research a second book in the kingdom. It was a great partnership between my university and King Saud University, one of the kingdom's great universities. And while I was there, right before that happened, this was late 2012, I was going to start in 2013. The friend was getting married in Sheffield, and I looked sort of following the media, and I saw that there was an exhibit, hashtag come together. Took me a minute, got it, hashtag come together. And first of all, that was a wonderful thing. I'm thinking, wait, that's interesting. And I was going to go do a follow-up book to my first book, which had been in political science. I talked about women. Art played a role, but it was a larger book about history, politics, culture, and society. And I went to this art exhibit, and it was in London. And we sort of made time to do it, and I was absolutely blown away because I saw a series of artists, and those artists were beginning to think about the ideas that we see today in Vision 2030. They're beginning to envision a society through their art. Again, very great phrase that we talked about earlier, pre-conversation, Ezra Pound, that artists are sort of the antennae of society, that they can feel things, sense things. And I'd always been aware of that. In fact, I'd written a paper in Maher Zain, a Lebanese Swede, actually, who had become a very important performer and done some work also that had seemingly sensed things with the Arab Spring as well. And he's a performer, he's Swedish, but is over 1 billion hits on YouTube and videos that are found throughout the world. And so I was aware of the arts, and I was aware the arts could be important, very important. But I went in, and I remember seeing one of the first pieces I saw was Ahmed Mattar's piece called Cowboy Code. What a piece, right? On one side, you've got the sort of cowboy code from the mid-20th century, America, mid-20th century. On the other side, mid-20th century, on the other side, you've got the Islamic laws of war from the Prophet Muhammad, both there. And how would you put those both things in the same space? And I should note they're with red bottle caps, sort of play bottle caps from cowboys, right? It's made of all these things. What do those two things have in common? How can something from the mid-20th century, right, be in common with something from way back in the 6th and 7th century? How's that possible? But Mattar saw it. There were phrases, for instance, dealing with women that were identical on both.
Interesting. That would be interesting. So just to interrupt, sorry. I think our technical wizard, Lucian, I mean, if you're viewing this, if you're consuming this 966 episode on YouTube, there'll be pictures up. Yeah. And so there'll be you'll be able to see this because you provided us with a lot of images. And like I said, Lucian's a technical wizard. So anyway, just so the viewers could know. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, and that's a great thing. And by the way, one of the wonderful things about this is you get to spend time with artists, which is terrific. See their art, and also they've been very generous. Let me just say this as a plug: very generous with their time. And can I say something about, before going further, just quickly about artists? One of the wonderful things, as a Western scholar, we look at artists as people who go make art, right, in their art wherever they do their art, in their studio, and then come back and sort of say, this is my art, this is what I think. So as a scholar, when I went to go interview people like Ahmed Mattar and Abdul Nasser Garam, very famous artists, I would assume I would be asking the questions. Instead, they asked me the questions. What do you think?
Interesting. Curiosity.
Oh, curiosity, but also I suddenly realized that these pieces have multiple meanings. And at a certain level, part of the beauty of Saudi art is its ability to take on different meanings depending on the audience. In fact, it can have opposite meanings depending on who you are in the audience. And that's a remarkable thing when we think about art, when we think about how, when we think about art and how these things operate, the think in those terms, and again, thinking about coming to a dialogue. How do you, and again, the idea of dialogue and be able to evolve in different contexts.
So sorry to interrupt, Sean. So this, you wandered into this Suffolk exhibition, Edge of Arabia, in what, 2004?
Yeah, no, this is 2013. I mean, I was aware of it already, but this is hashtag Come Together, by the way. Isn't that a great title? Hashtag Come Together. And of course, that's back to the famous Beatles song.
Right.
They're in London. What else are they going to do? And, in that context, and I saw that piece and I realized, wait a second, I thought I understood something about this Muslim world. By that point, I'd been teaching about 10 years. I'd got my doctorate 2005, 2006. So, I'm an associate professor. I've got a book. I've taught classes. I've lived overseas. I'd been a Fulbright scholar in Syria and Turkey and also in Malaysia. And I suddenly realized there's something here I don't understand. And that if I'm going to go spend time in the kingdom, if I'm going to spend time, and I was fortunate enough to live in the kingdom and travel all the way all over the kingdom, that I needed to understand this art, that this art was going to tell me something about the kingdom, but also about the world I was living in, and that they had things that they were seeing truths that I was going to be a better teacher and a better scholar, and I understand my own world and my own country better if I understood and spent time with these scholars. And again, I say scholars, they're artists, but they're also scholars too. They're enormously intelligent, intellectual people.
I love your enthusiasm. I mean, and so this is not only an academic journey, it's a bit of a spiritual journey as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's a spirit. It's all of the above. And for me, it's been an opening journey. Again, it also allows me to build on my own, my own heritage, my own traditions. But it's, I think, really important to understand where they're coming from. And they've got a voice. And it's a voice that's listened to. And one of the great things amazing things about Vision 2030, and I had no way of predicting this back in 2013, was that Vision 2030 has looked at this and realized this has real value. That what they're doing has enormous value, not only in, as you correctly said, in the arts, we'll talk more about that in a moment, but almost all throughout society. The idea of creativity is something that is, that is being pushed. Noon Academy, for instance, which is an education startup, one of the most successful in the Middle East, is a Saudi startup. Again, this idea of creativity and the idea that, that we're going to learn music. Why? Not just because we're going to learn music or look at art because it's beautiful. That's certainly important, but also it inspires us to think about something different. And it's a reminder, again, that nothing is done alone and that we can learn a lot by listening to these other voices.
So, and this is something when we've talked with others about the art scene, the understanding and they want to remind us that it existed prior to the Vision 2030.
Oh yeah.
But I think it's fascinating that you say that one of the aspects of Vision 2030 was recognizing the importance of this creative element. And so how does that, when I say it existed, I mean, what's the state of affairs of the art scene in Saudi Arabia in 2013?
Sure. And it goes back even before. I mean, one of the most important singers, Muhammad Abdu, who I'm sure your listeners will know, viewers will know, was one of the great singers. And there's a whole series of very famous singers. Alicia Keys, when she did her performance in the Kingdom, actually referenced at least one of them. So that, that these are very much part of their tradition. They go back way, way, way back.
Right.
Way back to the middle of the century. And also this is a culture that's produced poetry even back. But the state of the specific artistic scene was that there was a specific trajectory that had begun in the South. Khalid bin Faisal, who was then governor from the early 70s into the mid 2007, I believe, recognized that there was a problem. That there were issues, particularly in the southern part of the country, but also sort of that there were tensions within Saudi society. And he wanted to find ways of resolving them or addressing them. And it's interesting, he wasn't acting as a governor or as a government official. He was acting as sort of as an important person, but said, okay, we need to do this. And one of the things
he's an artist
really
himself.
did that
Yeah.
was multiple of the 9/11 bombers were from the South. This was unheard of. That the assumption was that the South was loyal and that many of the people who had been involved in Al-Qaeda had been from other parts of the country. Two of them, in fact, were from Asir, the province he was from. Walid and Wali, I think it's Walid, Walid and Wali al-Shekhri were the two people who were from that. And in fact, to show you how small the world is, and it's great you asked this question, two of them gone to high school with another artist who was in that, Abdul Nasser Garam. One of the artists who I saw in hashtag Come Together, part of this larger thing of Edge of Arabia, had gone to high school with these guys. And talks about the fact sort of his own worldview. Actually, he just recently, just in Germany, for instance, but his own worldview was very similar, but he went in a different direction. He didn't go to Al-Qaeda. He became a soldier in the army, a commando. In fact, I believe he missed his first show because he had to be on a commando exhibition.
Priorities.
Yeah, I guess we got your priorities. But and in fact, his opening book actually book has a picture of him of art as a picture of him in his military uniform, which makes for a sort of and he, by the way, is an enormously and he had a great piece in that. We were very lucky that first show hashtag come together.
So
We were really lucky, my wife and I, when we visited. It's this great piece called Capitol Dome, and it's got the U.S. Capitol. It's got a black thing that could be oil, could be something else. It's got a below the dome a quotation from sort of the Fatiha, the opening of the Quran. It's got Lady Liberty in front. And we were really lucky because no one was in the gallery that we were able to sort of slide under it a bit. Just my wife's, we were able to get pictures under it to see it. And it was a wonderful creative work of art. And I realized I was looking at those pieces. I'm going like, well, these guys are talking at a level that I hadn't seen before. And I got to the kingdom and I began investigating that. I was based in Riyadh at King Saud, and I began investigating that. And that meant I needed to go travel to the south. So I went to where this had begun, this actual movement had begun in the south, a place called Al-Miftaha. And this was this sort of an art studio, for lack of a better word, not an art school or anything, an art studio that had been founded by Khalid bin Faisal in the early 2000s. Other things, Watan newspaper, some other things that were founded as well. But it was there were art prizes and other things. But he did this as a way to start reviving society in the South. We have a problem. We need to think about how are we going to revive society. And they began, and you sort of, okay, this is a place you can do art. And a group of people had gotten together, people like Ahmed Matar, Abdel Nasser Garma got together. And you know what they did? They formed a majlis. They started talking.
Yeah.
Garam had been from a family, his father or grandfather had been an important person who had also led majlis, so he knew where it was. He was stationed in the military at the time in a place called Hamis Musheit, next to Abha, the capital of this year. And it was, they began to talk, and it coincided with the introduction of the internet. So they suddenly were able to educate themselves. And remember, none of these guys who had become famous artists had any education in the arts outside of what they might have taken in high school.
So is this majlis of their own or under the auspices of Khalid Faisal?
It's on their own.
Yeah.
They have a very famous red couch, for instance. Yeah, they just sort of got together and started talking. But Khalid bin Faisal would sort of push them along. For instance, the man named Stephen Stapleton, an English artist, was visiting an exhibit and was asking questions about Middle Eastern art, and asked a lot of questions and during a tour. And another person on the tour said to him, if you're interested in going to Saudi Arabia, call this number. And the person who was there, and shows you just how crazy this is, was Khalid bin Faisal's son.
So as we know, as you know, I mean, there's quite specific regions in Saudi Arabia, and they each have their identity and their affinities and their loyalties. Now, are we offending any particular region by saying
no? First of all, we would not want to offend anyone.
No. What I'm saying is like if I'm Hijazi and I'm going, what do you mean talking about arts? Coming out of the South, we had our own culture here.
Oh, sure. And, first of all, and one of the things that's terrific about the arts, and you'll see this, for instance, with comedy, with stand-up comedy, would be another thing that would develop out of this, is that they are understanding of regional connections and linkages. And no, let me go back just for a second. The arts was a very problematic issue. After the attack on the Kaaba, after the and the conservative trend in Saudi society in
1979, just for
79. Thank you for that. But also sort of a conservative trend from the 80s forward. Art really didn't fully disappear from public life, but came very close to. That you didn't have art classes, you didn't have art exhibits, you didn't have music, even though you had famous Saudi musicians and a well-developed music scene. That you didn't have public performances.
Correct.
Muhammad Abdu, the person I mentioned earlier, for years didn't have public performances up until 2017. So a very famous one. In fact, a DJ joked that the only place that they had public sort of music performances were at weddings. sort of jokingly say that were our sort of dance floors or dance clubs were weddings.
Well, this is one of the interesting things about Vision 2030, and that 1979 attack and that year 1979 was a sort of a benchmark. Was that that same year the Iranian Revolution occurred, same year Russia invaded Afghanistan,
right?
And the Saudi leadership decided they needed to move significantly right and more conservative in order not to be outflanked, and so consequently there was more control over the public sphere, art sphere by Muslim conservatives. So arts were suppressed. They went into, did they go into hiding? What?
Oh, sure. I mean, first of all, arts didn't go into hiding. Even there were still arts courses in high school, but it wasn't part of the public discourse.
And by the way, just sorry to interrupt, Sean.
Yeah.
I mean, part of this vibrant society is a quite conscious choice to go, all right, let's go back pre-79. Let's have a more moderate Islam, more open.
Right.
So they recognize that this was a watershed moment that probably led them in terms of arts and society too far to the right. And they want to go back and unwind some of this. But anyway, so and you're getting this is fascinating because again, we constantly hear the arts were there, artists were there, creators were there, but as you're saying, they were quiescent. It was too problematic to be out, and they didn't have platforms or forums to do so.
Right. It was done in one thing. There's a fascinating conversation that's sort of mentioned where foreign journalists interviews circa 79, 80 a senior prince, and he's asked sort of, you can't go on conservative like this. And the prince says, our kids are more conservative than we are. So that it's a sort of interesting sort of that, but you're right. The idea of going back in time and in fact, echoing, there's a movie, Baraka Meets Baraka, a great movie, 2016, Hisham Faki stars in it, other people as well. Mahmoud Sabah is the director, that has that conversation. And in fact, has a question, like back in the 70s, we had art, we had music, we had culture, we had Saudi players on our soccer team. Why can't we go back to that? And it was a remarkable moment when the movie came out, and shortly thereafter, Mohammed bin Salman's giving a speech, and he echoes those words from the movie. That there's a sort of understanding of a conversation and a dialogue that are happening at multiple levels. And that dialogue and conversation to me are important. And can I mention one of those sort of how this develops? I mean, can I example of and what's interesting, by the way, about the lack of arts is that part of what the art scene does at the beginning of the 21st century is the Khalid bin Faisal is the people in the South, initially in the South, but it's going to spread throughout the country, begin to look at these challenges as an opportunity. That they say, okay, we're not going to be able to articulate our art in the same way or talk about what the concerns we wish to talk about in the same way. How do we then develop a type of art that can function in this context? How do we develop a type of thinking? For instance, the one I mentioned, Ahmed Matar, that piece, is a doctor by training. One of his great pieces is called The Evolution of Man. And The Evolution of Man is a great picture where it's from an X-ray, and it goes from a man with a gun to his head evolving to a gas tank son.
Depending on which direction you go.
Depending on which direction you're reading it. Right. What does it mean? Yeah. And it's a great picture. And again, part of it is he's an artist, right? Artist.
Right.
And he says, I'm a doctor. So I'm not speaking to society. I'm not telling you what I think. I'm providing you with a diagnosis like a doctor. Oh yeah, another great piece he does. He's got another wonderful piece called book called Desert of Farron, which has hundreds of pictures from all over Mecca, and you see both the poorest of pictures and the wealthiest of pictures all in one place. And by the way, there are women here too. Everyone always sort of asks me that question. Arwa Naami. Wonderful picture, a wonderful one that she's done. Manal al-Dawain is another one. There's a great piece she does, and this is Arwa Naami, called Never Neverland. And just 1 second, I'll finish. Yeah. It's women driving bumper cars. from 2014.
And Ahmad Mahler has that famous one with are they magnets around the Kaaba?
Yeah.
It's quite visually compelling.
Oh yeah.
So there's the culture's there, the environment and the community is there, and they're negotiating how to express themselves in this post 79 world. And let's face it, and King Abdullah, had some liberalizing tendencies.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He tried to open up, and as you say, significant figures like Halal Turkey, Halal Faisal rather. We'd like to get his brother Turkey bin Faisal.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way,
on the show. And actually, to be honest, when I communicate with Prince Turkey, it's like everyone wants to talk to him about contemporary affairs, U.S. Saudi, this. I'd love to talk with him about the legacy of King Faisal and the Faisal Foundation, which is extraordinary, done extraordinary things. Yeah, and the reason is because, just as you say about Khalid Al Faisal, I mean, there's a significant creative intelligence habit in that family.
Oh yeah, and the contributions they've made. I mean, and look, he, some people have been Faisal thought maybe he might end up being a king or something like that. He didn't, but he's made significant contributions just as governor of Asir.
Oh my, yes.
And now has also been governor of Mecca, governor of education, someone who's interested in the arts, has these arts. And I should, these artists what they do is they develop a sort of scene in the South that begins to spread out in a model.
All right.
I mean, Arwa is another person from the South also that I just want to make sure I got it in. I didn't mean to interrupt you, so I wouldn't forget, because it's a wonderful piece of work. Another one called Lipstick that she does. Manal Dawayan is another artist who's actually from the Eastern Province, does this terrific piece called Suspended Together that is a bunch of doves flying, but they are cards. They are basically pieces of paper that are signed documents allowing women to travel.
Huh.
And so, and again, depending on how you look at it, it looks like a group of things flying, but if you look closer, something else is going on. And, part of the point of it is, as an art gallery owner said to me at the time, it allows everyone to get their own say, to have their own say, speak about what they're looking at.
Right.
That if you don't define it, I use this horribly academic term, esoteric, but it means something that can have multiple meanings for which somebody else can define.
Well, it can't be as bad as inosculation, which Lucian dropped on us recently.
but
Lucian wins. Lucian wins the esoteric.
Still number one, baby.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whatever you just said, Sean, is simply a pretender to enosculation.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But in terms of, and I in these other contexts, you want to be clear. But the idea basically is that they're producing this art and they're talking about different things. One of the pieces you like, Sarat, that wonderful piece that's set in the South with the roadway. He's doing that there are other pieces in 2006, 2007. It's an amazing piece about a bridge that collapsed. Very famous. It was actually built by the Bin Laden family. And it was supposedly the safe bridge in a wadi in the South. And the town people went there when there was a flood and it collapsed. And it was a horrible moment. And he takes a picture of it, and he's doing this, two things about it, which are fascinating. One, he's doing this piece right when there are issues in other parts of the country with infrastructure, Jeddah famously. Although he's not directly talking about it, these are issues that are there. And you also see that when he did the exhibit, there were questions about the piece. There were some people who thought it's this picture going out, it's very haunting. And it has Sirat written on it on the ground, and it's this thing going out into the black distance. And some people thought he was talking about walking on the Quran or Quranic images. And it was so bad in London when they were going to do the exhibit many years ago, that he eventually actually had to come up with another piece. It was somebody else defining it, but because of the potential of somebody else, and the ended up piece he did instead was these series of pictures called The Stamp. Sort of stamping on, in Saudi Arabia has lots of stamping. It says have a bit of commitment, for instance, inshallah or Amin. A lot of humor with this. Humor, by the way, is a wonderful tool for this type of art, because the best jokes assert one thing, right, when needing something else.
So it's germinating in the South. All right, it's strong in the South. And where does it? Are there regions that follow that come out? I mean, is there a path, or is it sort of diffuse and all over?
It diffuses all over the country. I mean, Manal, for instance, I just mentioned, is from the Eastern Province, but there are going to be people who are going to from the Hejaz, from Mecca, from Riyadh. All of will be involved, and it's going to sort of, that's the initial generation up, but it's going to start picking up. These are people born initially 70s, people born in the 70s, and people more earlier, say older millennials, people born in the 80s begin to emerge, many of whom have gone to school in the United States. And they're going to often they're going to be contributed. Hisham Faqih, who I mentioned earlier, was one. Another one, very part of this generation, also extremely bright, Raneem Bukhari, who's going to found an art place called Desert Designs. That's in the Eastern Province. And that's going to have, she's also going to have art that's exhibited, but also Hunna and some other things that will not only bring art, but also create frameworks by which art is not only elite, but can go to the masses.
So let me ask you a question, and it'll speak to your professorial philosophical self. You have artists who are a community that's trying to express itself in a difficult environment, right? And they may have champions, but they have plenty of opponents.
Sure.
It's a conservative society, majority conservative society who wouldn't feel comfortable. So they may what progress they have or what acceptance they have is so that's one challenge.
Sure.
So now, Ahmed Mater is one of 12 artists invited to this Wadi Al Fan,
right.
Valley of Art out near Al Ula, which is a major installation, government supported. And one of the artists there said, "This is just amazing because, whereas before I would try and express my art, encounter opposition and difficulty and that sort of thing. Now the government is supporting me 100% and wants me to go forward. These are now two different challenges for an artist." And so, yes, how do artists, how are they negotiating this sea change? Everything's different.
Oh, absolutely. And remember earlier, there's some generation who died penniless, figuring out ways to monetize your art. Right. The second generation of artists are going to, again, people like Garam and Mata are now world famous. They have pieces exhibited, say, like County Museum or British or major museums. Monetizing is a different challenge for them. But yes, absolutely. There are two challenges that are there. First, monetizing, and that second generation, people like Hisham Faqih, for instance, Ali Khathami, they would work together at Telfaz, were able to develop online systems, for instance, YouTube, effectively television platforms that began to develop actual funding for themselves. Telfaz 11, for instance, has gotten private, which was based in Riyadh, now based in Jeddah, is now significant private investment. Which is beginning to do that. And of course, anytime you're working with the government, it raises other questions, for instance, about artistic integrity, artistic independence. In fact, some of those artists, for instance, have sort of complained that people always want to ask us about government. Why don't we talk about our art? And that's an interesting challenge for all sides. That independent voice is something, and having that independent creative voice is something that is in the incentive for everybody involved in the process. How to get that is complicated, but it is something that all sides are aware of and working on. And I should note, by the way, with people confused with the kingdom, it's not surprising. Its name is Saudi Arabia, and the royal family's name. So people almost are blinded to think when they look at the kingdom to begin and end their sentences with the king or with the monarch or the crown prince, when it's a much larger country that deserves a conversation.
So how are they being received? So we understand Saudi Arabia is vastly majority conservative, and just like Texas,
right?
In its own right, is this community and its art and the things it's producing, is it gaining wider acceptance? Is more, or is it just a select demographic in the society that is being supportive, or is it broader than that?
No, it's much broader than that. Yeah, it's much broader. Yeah, first of all, remember, this is a society that's we've always assumed about sort of in the society being conservative, and it certainly is based on what happened in the 80s and the 90s into the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. But we've been on a transformative period for almost 20 years. so that the kingdom is, King Abdullah, again, support the arts was part of a transition. And that transition reflect the fact that things were already there. If you're in the kingdom, you will have vastly, for instance, if you visit families, you will have vastly different contexts. There will be certain families where men and women will be split. Yeah. There are other families where you will visit, for instance, where it will be like you're visiting an American household, no different. And in part of that, it should be noticed that there are significant differences. But one of the things that Saudi artists have consciously done is built a type of art that can cross both the conservative and the liberal traditions,
which
in
I think
society, and moderates and everybody else. They want to create a type of art, to quote the American TV show, that can be all in the family, and that they've done it.
And I think it's to their credit, because that's a whole nother skill set involved with being an artist. And not only are you an artist, you have to raise it to another level where you can cross boundaries, you can be accessible to different audiences within your own country.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. And this is part of what is sort of my awe of what they do. And when I speak about them, I always have notes and other things nearby to make sure I do it right. Because the challenge they've done, to me, is in utter awe. And I do my best to understand what they're doing, to learn from their example, to think about how do I, and by the way, learn in my own class from my own dealings. How do I create in a classroom of, say, 35 students or how many students in the classroom? How do I create my own communication that will appeal to a maximum audience, that will understand how different things, and part of what I've done is learn from them. Oftentimes, when we think about this kingdom, particularly as Westerners, we do so from a sense of, well, they're developing towards us or something, or they're modernizing. I see it as a two-way street. There's much to learn from them. And that art in particular, comedy, again, stand-up comedy, and they have their own questions about issues we deal with, say, with race. Khalid Moss, for instance, is one of the stand-up comedians I've dealt with. And he'll have discussions about those issues within their culture and society. He's actually now doing, sort of tell you how these things are synthesized, a wonderful series he'll be doing starting in August in the Kingdom in Jeddah at the Comedy Club, which will do him as stand-up comedy, interactions with the audience, talking about philosophy, but also having musicians as well. And so it's not only that they're interested in all different voices, they're also interested in multiple artistic genres simultaneously.
Well, let's talk about that. One of the things we had, Dr. Mark Thompson and Dr. Neil Quilliam, who are with the King Faisal Center for Religious and International Studies, just doing groundbreaking and really unique work on socioeconomics in Saudi Arabia. And they talk about, we've had Mark twice and Mark and Neil once, and they talk about how the youth is driving change. Mm-hmm. The youth are driving change, and in the arts, is it fair to say that the youth are going to be gravitate, in particular, in terms of into things like music and comedy and that sort of thing? And so, and you just recently did a fascinating event at the High Jamil in Jeddah. Yeah. And can you tell us about that? And again, how, with particular reference to what youth, and you also you were at Soundstorm too, which I think is amazing.
Oh, it was. It was. Okay, let's back up here first. And by the way, I'm glad your timing is perfect as always, for two reasons. First, I'm aware of Mark's work, and of course I've read it and been aware of it for a long time. Important scholar in our field. But also, Hamza, when you mentioned the thing about Khalid Moss, you did it well, because that project in March would have not been possible without Khalid's help. And let me explain why. When Khalid and I had a great interview for the first book, he actually, as an opening discussion about culture and society and what it means to be a Saudi of African ancestry. And again, also Ibrahim, Mississippi is another one too, but with Hamas. And while he was doing it, he said to me, you need to start watching one of his friends named Hamza Hassawi. And I said, all right. And I did actually, my book actually was translated in Arabic this past year. And they asked me to do a revised introduction. So I did.
Mabruk.
Yeah. And what I did was, when I mentioned to Khalid that I was doing this, and he said, you got to write about Hamza. And so what happened was, just sort of to make a long story short, I was writing this, and I also had a conversation with another friend of mine named Plus Aziz, who's a Kuwaiti singer, but has done a lot of work interacting with Saudis. And we had a long conversation about Saudi music. And we got it together, and I wrote a piece about Plus Aziz, but also about other Gulf artists. Did that piece, published by AJSW, and that took off. And that ended up meaning that I ended up getting together at both a conference as well as a performance at High Jamil in Jeddah. And that performance, of course, was led by Hamza Hassawi as well. He was the star performer. He actually won the Middle East X Factor. Terrific crooner singer. Great guy also. One of the nicest people. He's actually actively at work, working on his new album. You take a look on his social media, you'll see this. So I thank him, by the way, I asked for a couple of pictures to share, Lucian, with you. So he was nice enough to take a minute to do that. But yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that it was amazing to do that. And I should note for a moment, when I worked with one of the artistic managers, when I sort of contacted people and about doing this performance, and I in this performance at High Jamil, two things about it. High Jamil were absolutely fantastic to work with. They provided an absolutely perfect space, beautiful, perfect space in the kingdom. And it's interesting because one of the manager, music performers said, Jamil, I thought he, the guy who founded the foundation and provided money for the foundation, I thought he didn't like music. I thought he thought music and Islam weren't necessarily linked together. And the idea that, and he looked at me and said, but now they want to do music. I said, yeah, they do. Absolutely. Why wouldn't they? And that gives you an idea of the transformative element of music in the kingdom and how much the society has changed and how it's in part being driven by youth. I mean, that's like 1/5 of kids 18 to something in government statistics have musical instruments.
So let me get straight to the core of this. How much has society changed?
It has changed, and it is changing rapidly. And again, two things that sort of show you. One, of course, and I'm sure you both have seen this in public, is the amount of women in public, in public places. The amount of women driving. I mean, that's an obvious, tangible change. And for instance, although there are still family and single male sections, those are now crossed. That's an enormous difference. My wife, for instance, lived with me when I did my research in the kingdom and talked about wearing, she would have to wear the abaya. And in fact, one of the great questions, Richard, she'd actually ask me, how would we eat when we visit friends' houses? And I'd say, we're going to have to find out when we get there with her. And you might be with me, you might not be. We'll figure it out. And, that's one thing. The other thing that's really remarkable is music that you're in, and the amount of cafes that have spread, thousands of cafes that have spread about the kingdom, many of which are actually run by women. And you will hear music in a way in public spaces that you hadn't before. And that's really remarkable. That you will go, for instance, you're in a cafe in say Riyadh, artistic cafe, and you will hear Kulthum being played. If you go to Riyadh Gallery, this large amusement place, and parts of it actually kind of look like Times Square, there are huge, large speakers that are there. And they're also developing for the first time public places to play music. There had actually been in my compound in Riyadh several months before I got there in 2013. There had been actually a raid on it because someone had done a concert there. Now today, so that gives you an idea of sort of if you played a concert that you might be raided by the Mutawa, often translated as the religious police. Today, there are places like the Music Space, for instance, which is built in Jeddah, or Makan. These are two fantastic artistic places that exist as well. Hani Hoja, for instance, is one of the people running the Music Space as well. You have a development of an industry, young people. Wassim Omran, for instance, is effectively a booking agent for different types of people. He himself actually tried to play in public in the Eastern Province in public a number of years ago, and that was a complicated matter. But even today, even complicated issues about for him even a number of years ago getting married, about sort of working through like, wait, this guy does music. Wait, is that okay? Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. And I should note, there are both men and women involved. Glenda Sherry, another person, wonderful singer as well, who was part of that. I should note when the event in at High Jamil, again, terrific guests, terrific host for us. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful, wonderful evening. With that evening, she, for instance, performed before, and I met her and we talked during sound check. She came up and she was wearing an abaya, right? And when she did her performance on stage, she was wearing a pink suit, woman's suit. It was yeah. And it was amazing to watch. Sort of, you're talking about youth generated change. As I was there, watching what was going on, people were dancing. Men and women were, they weren't necessarily dancing good, but there were people dancing. And among the women, there were women who were dressed as sort of Westerners, but also women who were sort of Western clothing or that way, but also women wearing a dancing. And also, more importantly, Richard, you ask about acceptance, taking videos of themselves to be posted on social media.
Truly, but there remains like you say, and I think that's an interesting story. With she wears an abaya, and then when she's on stage, she wears something else. There is a tension.
Oh, sure.
There remains a tension, and for non-Saudis or for Americans who are just Saudi Arabia, they sort of can't get the paradox, because they go, all right, wow. Theaters back in Saudi Arabia, 2018. The cinema industry sector is just booming. They're doing major blockbusters movies like Kandahar and Desert Warrior, and women are going to theaters. Artists are coming out. Saudi artists. They have Red Sea Film Festival. It's just busting along. Oh, by the way, you can't. We're not gonna show.
Certain films. Yeah,
we're not going to say Doctor Strange or The Eternals, or recently, Lightyear, because portrayal of alternative lifestyles or drug use or whatever. So tell me about the paradox. And for us who's so deeply involved with it, it makes sense because it's consistent with many things in our own society as it transitions from, and moves forward and that sort of thing. But I'm interested in your take on it.
Two things. First, it has happened so quickly. The people who, that for a long time.
By the way, that should be the theme, the overlying, the Chiron for Saudi Arabia. It's happened so quickly. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Again, as an expert, I worry that what I write or what I talk about will be, I have to go back, try to regularly get back to the kingdom, because I fear that if I miss something, if I don't get back there regularly, if it's there December and spring, I'll get back there hopefully later this year, that if I'm not there, I'm going to, miss things. And can I give an answer to that about to understand the kingdom and this paradoxes? I can't quote a Saudi. I'm going to quote another Saudi artist, because again, I seek to learn from their example. There's a great interview with Hisham Faqih, who spent time in the States, and when talking about Saudi and that question of the paradox, he said he looks at America, and he says, "Look, I'm not going to. Yeah, Hollywood has got a certain vision of what America looks like, but that's not day-to-day life in Florida or North Dakota or New York. Look, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee." Middle Tennessee here, and life even within the region, between Nashville versus Murfreesboro, where my university is, versus other places, are different, and that can be starkly different. A couple of counties over, and the answer is, if you want to understand those differences in that culture and those contradictory forces, look at our own society, and we're hardly alone. Look at countries in Europe or in Asia, where there are starkly differences, even a couple of miles over, between different communities, and also different cultures in society. It's not only speed, but also this is a culture that has hundreds of tribes, where there are significant differences of culture and tradition, depending on where things are. One of the great things I should know about in the South is the South is having a consistent artistic tradition. In fact, Matar talks about the fact that his own mother was an artist in her own right, and helping him learn that as well. It's fascinating how different artists think in those terms.
Dr. Sean Foley specializes in Middle East history and the cultural, political, and religious trends in the wider Islamic world. Dr. Sean, this was awesome. Great discussion. You're going to have to come back. There's plenty of meat left on this lamb bone for us to get into. So, we'd love to have you back.
I'd love to.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.